So we have Daniel Pomerantz, the CEO of Honest Reporting. Daniel began his career as an attorney in the United States, where he worked for high-profile law firms in New York and Chicago before starting his own law practice and later moving to Israel. As CEO of Honest Reporting, Daniel manages the entire organization, its staff and programming, ensuring media accuracy regarding Israel. Through critique, direct coordination with journalists, missions to Israel, and proactive communication on social and conventional media, Daniel serves as the adjunct faculty at the IDC University in Herzliya, where he teaches in the Adelson School of Entrepreneurship and Bar-Ilan University in the School of Management. It's a lot. He is also a contributor to Newsweek and the Jerusalem Post, and is a frequent on-air panelist for I24 News and ILTV News in Israel. Due to his expertise in business as well as US and international law, Daniel brings a unique perspective to discussions of Israel and media bias. He lectures, debates, and his television appearances include US and Israel policy in the Middle East with proper context, domestic and international law, media ethics and portrayal of Israel in the press, the impact of recent events on Israel, the Middle East, and public perceptions. He has also worked in publishing and communications in positions such as executive editor and chief executive officer. Okay, so with a distinguished biography like that, I'd like to welcome our next guest. And joining us from Jerusalem, from Honest Reporting, is Daniel Pomerantz. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Kasim and Corina.
So first of all, I mean, I don't know what to say about the situation in Israel right now. It's so tense. There's so much going on with rockets and constant attacks. Can you just give us a bit of an insight into what it's been like living in Israel for the last few weeks? And I know I say last few weeks, you've been dealing with terror since Israel's rebirth, but just with the current conflict.
Yeah, well, to some extent, it depends on where you are. There's the practical side and the emotional side. The emotional side, everyone feels, whether you're living in the south where most of the rocket fire is coming, or in the north where it's relatively less, you're still feeling tension, both because you're concerned about, other people, and also because you know that this can spread and it can hit people anywhere. If you're in the south, people, like in places like Ashkelon, for example, and certainly in places like Sderot, people won't even leave their homes to go to the grocery store. They're stocking up on food and trying to just never leave at all.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's pretty intense. You come up to a place like Tel Aviv, which is a little farther. Now, down there, they're close to Gaza. They get maybe 15 seconds from the time a siren sounds until the time a rocket hits. Up in Ashkelon, it might be as much as 30 seconds. In Tel Aviv, it's 90 seconds. So first of all, 90 seconds is a pretty decent amount of time. And also, we've had rocket fire from time to time. For a while, we were getting woken up every night, a few times a night, so we weren't getting enough sleep. And of course, I'm working really hard because Honest Reporting is dealing with interviewing and looking at the news and doing all this stuff. So all day I'm busy, and then at night I'm running to a bomb shelter. But basically, the feeling in Tel Aviv is we'll go out, but a lot of people just sort of like to stay relatively close to buildings. So that way, if something happens, even if you're out on the street, you can run into a bomb shelter. If you get caught sort of away from a building, you have to lay down on the ground in a prone position and link your fingers behind your head. And that way, if there's a direct hit, there's nothing you can do. You're dead. But if you're within the blast radius and you're down in that position, the hope is that maybe the shrapnel might mostly miss you. But of course, you're better off if you're near a building and can get into a shelter. One of the things I normally like to do is I like to do SUP, stand-up paddling. You get out onto the sea with the paddleboard. So, of course, that's out of the question. You're out in the sea, there's no way you can get to a shelter in any amount of time. So activities like that are kind of off limits, except for people who are, daring and crazy and take their life in their hands. But for the most part, life is a little bit tense and a little bit quiet. You walk on the streets, there's less people around. A nice thing is you can go to, a restaurant that usually requires reservations very easily. And the way I see it, though, if I'm in my house and I have to run to a bomb shelter in my building where I live, or if I'm in a restaurant and I need to run to the restaurant's bomb shelter, to me, it's the same difference, So I'm willing to take that chance. But I think a lot of people sort of prefer to be at home, and especially if they have kids, they don't want to be messing around. So there's the level of tension and effect it has on your life kind of depends on where you are. But I can also tell you that if anytime that anybody is under attack, whether it's a country being under attack, or whether it's domestic violence or child abuse or anything, or PTSD, such an important thing is to feel heard and to feel listened to. And when we look at the coverage around the world, it sort of feels like victim blaming. It feels like when they talk about the Me Too movement, like it was such a big deal because if women spoke out, the women would get hurt and would lose their careers. And that's kind of what it feels like. A friend of mine who's a woman who has been involved in Me Too activities before because she's in entertainment and dealt with that, she said it's the same feeling of not being able to speak out, or if you do, you're going to have to be prepared for what's going to hit you. And, it's not like a hurricane where, it sucks, but everyone in the world cares about you and is sending you care packages and saying nice things about you. This is a little more like being in an abuse situation. And it's really emotionally hard on Israelis. And it's an emotional toll that I think people are going to take with them beyond this. This is a country where sometimes you might see someone cut in line and then someone else reacts like really strongly and shouts at them, whereas you might not see that in America or Europe as much, where people are more polite. And I don't know if it's true, but I sort of have a theory that those sorts of activities relate to this, like especially the people who think that they're dealing with it okay and that they're just sort of not being affected. Those are the people who are most likely to have an outburst because somebody stepped on their toe a month later.
Wow. That's a powerful analogy.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, and it's a weird dichotomy because in some places you're sort of living normal life, and then at the same time you're not. Like right now I'm sitting here in my office talking to you. I'm surrounded by computers and coffee and all the things you have in an office, and it feels very normal. But I was doing this just a few days ago on a live television interview, and just a minute before the interview, the sirens started going. So I had to go down to the bomb shelter, and since the interview was by Zoom anyway, I was able to do it from my phone, and actually ended up being a very powerful interview because instead of talking about all the normal questions, I just talked about what was happening around me. But it's weird because like you're sort of living. It's not like you're on the beaches at Normandy. Like you're at home, but then you're also not, and so you're sort of experiencing both at once. And when you talk about this, like what we're going through. And I really appreciate you guys asking because it's so important for Israelis to talk about this. But, a lot of what I have when I'm in sort of a hostile interview situation, people are saying, but, you're talking about how hard it is to have to go to a bomb shelter every once in a while. What about, Palestinians who are getting hit more often, who don't have bomb shelters, who don't have Iron Dome? And look, it's a valid question. And there's an important answer that isn't really being heard. And that's that most of the rockets that are hitting Palestinian civilians are coming from Hamas. They fired, check, about 3,500 rockets at Israel, but a third of their rockets land right back in Gaza. Now, Israel's rockets, there's two things you need to know about an Israeli strike. One, they're very highly, carefully targeted at military targets. And the other thing is that they call their shots in advance if there's civilians nearby and give people time to get to safety. So if civilians die, either because they didn't get away or because it landed in a civilian area, chances are 99 out of 100 that it was a Hamas rocket that landed there. And we know this just from looking at the numbers. And, Israelis do feel a tremendous amount of pain and empathy for Palestinians in Gaza, but it's sort of like feeling pain for Syrians living under ISIS or Bashar Assad. It's like nobody would say nobody would blame the coalition forces for the Syrians suffering under ISIS. You blame ISIS for that. And I think there's a little reframing that has to happen. This isn't Israelis against Palestinians. This is Israelis and Palestinians and everyone who cares about peace and coexistence against terror organizations that are actively trying to stop peace. I kind of think, this may seem a radical thing to say, I don't think peace is that hard. It's already on the way anyway. People want it. People are moving toward it. When these terror groups work so hard to prevent it and invest so much in preventing it, that shows you just how possible peace is. You just have to call out the terror groups and not let them prevent it. And every time, in the world, the terror groups get a PR victory, it encourages them to do more of that. And that harms Palestinians worst of all, and harms Israelis very much too.
Or every time we give them money.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's this idea that you can somehow give money to humanitarian causes without it falling into the hands of the terror groups that run that area. And it's a noble idea, but it doesn't work in the real world. Hamas controls everything that happens in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, it's not on terror lists itself, but it has this $400 million a year martyrs fund to pay to support terrorism. And so there's really no way around the government's, Hamas isn't really a government, but what do you call the controlling entities that control these areas? You cannot get around them. But it is a bit of a catch-22, because if you don't give that money, conditions do deteriorate, and it does make things worse. But I think what the Western world has to realize is that for every dollar you give to these places, probably 90 cents of it is going to support terror, and maybe 10 cents at most is going to support the things you actually want to support.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So you touched briefly about PR victories for these terror groups. I want to circle back to what prompted you to get involved in your current role. And look, we're reading the headlines in the US, and I can't imagine what it would be like reading those as an Israeli. It's like, I mean, it's mind-boggling. You'd think that Israel is at war with Switzerland for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
So what keeps you committed to the field of work that you're in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually started at Honest Reporting just about 6 years ago. I made Aliyah, I immigrated to Israel about 10 years ago, and then I found this job there, and I was working at it as a writer and a content editor. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up becoming the CEO, which I've been for the past almost 3 years. At a moment like this, when we're under fire, having something to do that feels really meaningful actually makes it easier. And even when we're not under fire, having grown up in America, I always felt like this was so important. And I remember in 2009, when this was going on, I was in Chicago, and there was going to be a massive protest against Israel. So we went to that protest to do a little counter protest of our own. There was about 4 or 5 of us who were going to be waving Israeli flags, and the number of protesters was about 4,000, which, when you see, it's like a sea of people. It's like an ocean of humanity. It's enormous. And they were waving swastikas and burning Israeli flags and shouting death to Jews. I mean, this was not criticism of a country's policies. This was, you thought you could have been in Berlin 1938. And from what I see on the news, I see that happening all around the world now as well. And I honestly feel, as stressful as this is, and it is very stressful, I would rather be here in a bomb shelter with people who I care about and who care about me, and doing the work that I'm doing without fear. I don't care about anyone trying to cancel me. I do what I do, and it's, and people are listening. But I'd rather be doing this than to be in a country where people are waving Nazi flags and, my local police department isn't even trying to stop it. So you I guess you have to pick your danger in this world. You know what I'm saying? But, here at Honest Reporting, our job is to read those headlines every day. And I tell you, the worst part of my day is waking up and having to read all that. Because, in my job, I can't just ignore it. Yeah. But the best part of my day is when I get started doing something about it. And I might be writing something, or doing an interview, or preparing a video for YouTube or whatever. And then you feel a sense of, it's just a sense of meaning, that you're doing something in the world that makes a difference. And I do think it does make a difference. I think we as Israelis, and also as Israel supporters worldwide, are only just beginning to catch on to the idea that this is important. And also that there's language out there that we have to understand, a cultural language. I don't mean, just the English language. And as we begin to catch on to it, I really believe we can succeed at this. I think when you go out and do the right thing, eventually you get the right results.
Well, on that vein, obviously we've opened that can of worms, and we know that during conflicts in the past, there have been just horrendous media coverage, especially here in the U.S. And we, Kasim and I, have been kind of compiling some of these really bad headlines and bad articles, bad takes. And so just share with us, what are some of the ways right now in this current conflict, how has the media been spreading misinformation or blatantly lied, or how has it been deceptive right now in the past week and a half?
Well, the most obvious thing is one we already touched on, which is they go with this assumption that if a Palestinian died, an Israeli must have killed them. And sometimes they don't even assume it, but they'll say it outright. They'll say, X number of Palestinians killed by Israeli strikes. Well, as we discussed, most Palestinians who are dying are being killed by Hamas and Hamas's strikes. And then there's also the fact that Hamas fires their rockets from civilian areas, which is a double war crime. You're firing at civilians from civilians. So that's one. I saw this when Israel blew up this building that had a media center in it with the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, but also had Hamas's military intelligence there. They called up in advance. Everyone evacuated. Nobody got hurt. But then they, the way they wrote it in the press was Israel has not presented any evidence that that Hamas was there. Well, first of all, Israel has evidence. There's a difference between not presenting evidence and not having evidence. And Israel actually shared that intelligence information with the White House before the strike, and President Biden was very much aware of that. But what I noticed is that the journalists never mention that when you talk about Hamas casualty figures, Hamas never presents any evidence for that. And I don't fault journalists for saying you should present evidence, but they should be saying that about Hamas. They always refer to the Gaza Ministry of Health. Well, Gaza Ministry of Health is Hamas. It's not like it's a separate organization. Hamas is on the same terror lists as ISIS and the Taliban. I'm talking the U.S. list, the European ones, Australia, Canada, all the Western world. Not all the Western world, but almost every government in the Western world. So it's like taking casualty figures from ISIS and presenting it without doing any fact checking. And that's something that, the media went crazy about fact checking Donald Trump. My opinion was you should fact check the president of the United States. But why would you stop with the president of the United States and not fact check some of the most notorious terror organizations in the world? And there's an element, though, that goes a little deeper, and I think it's what made this a little more severe. There's a culture right now called wokeism, right? I don't know if all your listeners know about that. I know you guys do. And it can be summarized as the idea that every relationship can be defined as a relationship between an oppressor and a victim. And wokeism goes on to say more or less that basically all white people are oppressors, and also goes on to say all Jews are white people, which is just ridiculous when you say that in Israel, because we've got people from Yemen and Morocco and even people from Ethiopia who are just as African as an African American. In fact, in some ways more so because they came in just within the last generation. And yet the idea is that all Jews are white, and therefore all Jews are oppressors, and all Arabs or Muslims or Palestinians are victims. And as a result of that, that's the framing that a lot of people are bringing to this. And so it's very difficult to say, well, we're victims too because we have rocket fire, and the reaction is sort of like, no, you're not victims. You're just that's just white privilege talking, and that's an undercurrent that we're dealing with in the media now that we weren't seeing as much, I think, in 2014. So it's made it even a little more severe. I found the way to deal with that, because I've been speaking in a lot of hostile media environments, is to speak about the idea that reframing sides. It's not us versus Palestinians. It's us and Palestinians versus the people who are oppressing Palestinians, and along the way, by the way, also oppressing Israel and Jews.
So in general, though, are there any trends or things that you've seen where the coverage has been similar or dissimilar to the media's coverage of Israel's previous operations or conflict, CAS-led perimeter defense? Have there been any major differences, or are there a lot of similarities?
There are a lot of similarities, but one thing that's a little bit different, I think, is that there's this action going on at The Hague right now at the International Criminal Court to try and bring war crimes charges against Israel over what happened in 2014. So the charges that they want to bring are charges of apartheid and crimes against humanity. And of course, anyone who's been to Israel knows that the apartheid accusation is absurd. Arab Israelis serve in every level of government, including as Supreme Court justices and members of Knesset, and do everything from being movie stars to doctors and lawyers. But that's one of the charges that they're bringing in. Another charge that they're bringing is the charge of crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity is such a severe word, because that's the same word we use to describe genocide. That's the word we use to describe the Holocaust. And it's not by accident that they are trying to place Israel on the same level as the Nazis. And then you see explosions in Gaza, and they come with that narrative, well, this is, crimes against humanity. And of course, as we were talking about, it's very much not, if you know even a minimum amount of information. But because that's already out there in The Hague, you're seeing it pop up in a lot of headlines. And I don't just mean extreme groups or the groups that bring these reports or are trying to bring the case in The Hague. It's popping up in mainstream headlines, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. A lot of times they'll sort of fudge a little by saying that so-and-so says that this is crimes against humanity or apartheid. And they say, well, we didn't say it, we just quoted someone. But they'll put that in the headline, and what they won't put in the headline is so-and-so says this and they're wrong, and it's completely ridiculous. And, you wouldn't see them quoting ISIS with that kind of credibility, or the Taliban with that kind of credibility. So between the wokeism and the action at The Hague, it's created a degree of messaging around this that's already in place, a preset messaging, and so the conflict is being perceived from the outset within the framework of this messaging, as opposed to in 2014, the message kind of grew as the conflict evolved. So that's it's hard to see, and it's intentional. But I heard of this poll, a Gallup poll came out in February, that apparently Israel's approval rating in the United States is currently at 75%, which is very high. I didn't see a breakdown about how it varies by age or political party. But what's interesting is that rate is actually higher than it was 10 years ago. In fact, it's the highest that it's been at any time other than during the Gulf War in 1991, when Israel was just truly seen as a complete victim. And by the way, Golda Meir once said, I'd rather have condemnation than condolences. Now, personally, I'd rather have neither, but I'd much rather be dealing with a media storm than to actually be under fire by Scud missiles that are potentially tipped with chemical weapons.
Yeah.
But we're looking at long-term trends. Over 10 years, we've had conflicts in 2006, 2009, 2012, 2014, and yet Israel's popularity is growing. And that makes me think that the media is saying a lot of things, but it doesn't mean people are necessarily believing it. And you might hear something on the media and say, oh, how could they say that? And everyone must believe it. But it's not necessarily true. And, there are some young, very popular members of Congress right now that are saying some very, they're sort of the extreme progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And they get a lot of press because they're, hot figures right now. But they're still just junior Congress people. And there are other Congress people who are saying other things. So I think the media actually does us a disservice when it amplifies voices that don't really reflect the reality, not only of what's happening, but also of what Americans think and feel. And I don't know why America's attitude toward Israel has been improving despite this media storm, but I'd like to think that it's at least in part because of the work that groups like Honest Reporting and CUFI do in the world. That maybe over these years we've had a long-term incremental effect.
Obviously, social media is a huge source for a lot of people where they get their news and their information. And it's been a long time since I have had people unfollow me or, send me nasty direct messages over support for Israel. So there's a lot of misinformation being spread, a lot of things being retweeted and reposted as truth that isn't. So how has social media kind of played a role in the conflict? Obviously, traditional media continues to play one, but have you noticed how social media has maybe affected this narrative as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, the wonderful thing about social media is that, you can speak out directly to other people. The less good thing about it is that so can everyone else, and you don't need any kind of credibility or credentials. You can say anything you want. It could be that you're just an idiot, or it could be that you're intentionally lying and you're quite smart and aware of what you're doing. But either way, you can get that message out everywhere. And then a lot of conversations on social media begin with an article from mainstream news that someone posts, and then there's comments that form a conversation around it. So the mainstream media actually has an important impact on shaping the conversation on social media too.
That's true.
But, I've noticed that people get afraid. They're afraid to speak out. They're afraid of losing their job or their communities. And I always say there are some people who really have a job or live in a community where you really can't speak out. And if you're in that situation, I would never want to tell someone to do something that's going to harm them. But I do think that most people probably have a little more wiggle room than they realize. And sometimes you can be bold and try something and just see how it goes. And remember, you're not talking just to the person you're talking to on social media. You're not talking necessarily to the troll who's saying mean things to you. You're also talking to everyone else who's listening and who's reading it. And you want to direct your voice to those people. People are going to believe the person who seems smart and credible and likable and not angry or hate-filled. And if you can be that person and the person you're talking to isn't, don't feel frustrated you didn't convince them, because you might have convinced a bunch of people and you didn't even know it. And then, of course, I myself, I took the plunge at one point. When I was living in Israel, I just started writing a blog because I just needed to get the stuff off my chest, and I wasn't doing it in like an angry venting kind of way. I was just saying like, hey, here's how I see things. And it just felt good to talk about it. Well, that blog is what ended up leading to my current job. And so, sometimes if you're bold and you're true to who you are, your job and your community can form themselves around you, and you end up in a better place and more successful. And, I feel so privileged that I can speak my mind and nobody's going to stop me and nobody's going to cancel me, because, look, the people in the world who would cancel me, like, I'm not trying to work for them or get a job with them anyway, right?
In recent weeks, we've seen that the Biden administration, they've reinstated U.S. aid to UNRWA, UNRWA, who are in charge of the education for many Palestinian children. And time after time, they've been exposed for the propaganda, the hate education, the indoctrination of children. So, like, in your opinion, how does this exacerbate the conflict in terms of the Palestinian leadership persisting in indoctrinating its own people, its own children?
I think during the Trump administration, the Palestinians felt a great deal of pressure, and they reacted with a lot of strong language. And now I think they are perceiving that they have support for incitement, for some of these activities. The events here started with these riots on the Temple Mount at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that was all caused by incitement. And this is started with the Palestinian Authority, not with Hamas. Hamas started firing rockets because they were feeling irrelevant in the face of the Palestinian Authority's actions. I think it's a mistake for the Palestinian Authority to assume that this means some kind of support, but it is the message that they receive. And, diplomacy and politics is about communicating, and everything is communication. Words are communication. Giving or withholding aid is communication. Military action is a communication. When America moves an aircraft carrier into the South China Sea, that's communicating something without words. Everything is communication. And I'm not against giving aid to Palestinians if it can be done right and can be done safely, but the White House has to be very sensitive to what they're communicating when they do that, and to how they communicate when they do that. And the Taylor Force Act was put into place because the Palestinian Martyrs Fund paid for the murder of Taylor Force, a Christian American guy who was visiting Israel after his army service. He's a West Point graduate, and he was killed in this terror attack. And so they named the act after him because they didn't want American aid going to fund the killing of Americans. I mean, it shouldn't go to fund the killing of anybody, but Americans is particularly, there's something paradoxical about it. And so bringing back this aid, the White House has not yet explained how they're getting around the Taylor Force Act by or how they're doing this without violating the Taylor Force Act, and that's something that they're going to have to explain and address.
So the level of people being aware of the incitement, aware of what this aid money is going towards, is people simply don't know. Why is there almost an aversion, a hesitancy of the media to not cover this? I mean, in the US, for example, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 years about the education system, talking about history and is it perpetuating racism and all these things, and separate issue altogether. But you have a smoking gun with the Palestinian education system of incitement and terrorism and dehumanization, but nobody seems to really care in the mainstream media.
Yeah, it's because of this concept called narrative. Right, the priority of journalists these days isn't to tell you what happened, it's to tell you the story that they want to tell you. You know, honest reporting began in 2000 during the Second Intifada, and there's this famous picture, you can find it on our website in a section called The Photo That Started It All, of an Israeli policeman holding a club over his head and a young boy sitting in front of him with blood dripping down his face. And the headline in the New York Times was an Israeli policeman and a Palestinian on the Temple Mount. And as it turned out, that wasn't a Palestinian, the kid with the blood on his face. He was a boy named Tuvia Grossman, a Jewish kid from Chicago who had come to Israel to study in yeshiva, which is religious school. And he was being attacked by a mob of Palestinian rioters. And this police officer, who was Druze, which is, the Druze people sometimes self-identify as Arab, sometimes they don't, but their primary language at home is Arabic. And so you have this Druze, Arab, possibly Arab, depending on your point of view, police officer protecting a Jewish kid from a Palestinian mob. It was so the reverse of what the press had reported. And also it was the reverse in the sense that it was actually a story of the beautiful coexistence you have in Israel. I mean, here's this man who isn't Jewish risking his life for a kid who isn't Israeli. I mean, that should be a story that we should be celebrating. It's a model for coexistence around the world. And we knew back then, I mean, I wasn't with Honest Reporting back then, but the people back then knew it, that this wasn't just an honest mistake, or else it wouldn't have taken the creation of Honest Reporting to deal with it. It would have just taken like a quick letter to the editor. This was putting narrative over reality. And I mean, eventually they did get it corrected, but it took much more work than it reasonably should have. And it's sort of like there's that expression, what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. Or, you know, there's that poem, I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't this, and I wasn't this, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. We saw 20 years ago that this was coming, and we see it now in the mainstream, and it impacts all sorts of different areas. It impacts conversation on almost any issue you can name. It affected everything from, you know, the protests we saw in America. It affects COVID. It affects the presidential elections. Everything is impacted by the concept of narrative. And sometimes it's just laziness. You have a story and you don't want to do the digging, so you just fit the latest events into your story. Sometimes it's groupthink. All the journalists around you are saying something, therefore you think it must be true. And sometimes it's this desire to kind of appear moral and right in a world where wokeism is so important. And if I'm a journalist and I'm out there changing the world by speaking up for the little guy, you know, I always say, when journalists say, you ask someone, why'd you become a journalist? And they say, oh, I want to change the world. I want to protect people. I want to speak up for the little guy. I always say, you know, that's not journalism. That's activism. And activism is a completely admirable thing to do, but it's not journalism. It would be sort of like if a surgeon decided to kill certain people and save other people because the surgeon is going to judge who's right and who's wrong. What does a surgeon do? A surgeon saves everybody. And if that person happens to be a criminal, well, after the surgery, there are courts and lawyers to sort that out. And in Israel, doctors are very proud of the fact that they say, and after a terror attack, people get rushed to the hospital and the doctors will work on everybody. And you know how triage works in medicine. Whoever's in the most critical condition gets treated first. So if the person who had dynamite strapped to his chest is in the most critical condition, that person might get admitted to surgery before his or her victims. And doctors are proud of the fact that they don't discriminate in that way. And of course, there are courts and lawyers for afterwards. Journalists should also be proud of not discriminating in that way. You know, Woodward and Bernstein, at least from the way they talk, I can't read their minds, they weren't out to depose a president. You know, they were the ones who exposed Nixon and Watergate. They were out to just search for the truth wherever it led them. And I would like to believe that if the truth had been something that vindicated Nixon, they would have gone in that direction just as easily. That's what journalism is supposed to be. Anything else just isn't what journalism is. But if you fit the right narrative, you do have a better chance of winning that Pulitzer Prize.
Well, that's good. I mean, we're running out of time, and I wish we had more because, we pick your brain about this stuff for a lot longer. But just to go back to something you kind of started to talk about earlier, just how you started your blog, and in the end, all that we can do is speak up in situations like this. So for our listeners, and we have many Christian Zionists listening who want to know what they can do during this time. How can they share the truth about Israel? Like, what are some strategies that are effective as far as social media, or just what are some advice that you can give us as far as how we can participate during what is still a conflict?
Well, first things first, to share the truth, you need to learn the truth. And so I do recommend coming to HonestReporting.com. We have a daily newsletter that we send out, which is news, but we also have a lot of critiques of the news and response to the news and proactive content. And, we're available to speak at churches and at other forums if people want to speak to us. The next thing to do is to be active in your community, with your friends on social media, with your elected officials, and also with your local non-social media, but your mainstream media. Write an article in the local paper, or even write letters to the editor in the national press, and call up the television networks and ask if you can speak, or if someone is a particularly good speaker, or if you want to recommend someone who you think speaks well, like Kasim or me or anyone, you can lobby for us to be on the air. And everything that we can do as a group makes a big difference. Before we wrap up, could I share a really touching story?
Yeah,
sure.
Please.
In my own life, I went through some real challenges before I got to where I was. I had a time in my life when I was homeless and I was hungry, and now I'm the CEO of a really influential organization, and it's been a huge trajectory. And my friend, whose name is Joel, quoted to me from the book of Joel, which I thought was ironic. And he told me that quote about, "I will give you back the years that the locusts have eaten." Am I getting that right?
Mm-hmm.
He said to me, I believe in you so much. You're going to everything that you didn't get to do during those years. Because the years when I was in hardship, it felt like the worst thing was not even the hardship, but the feeling that I was missing out on life. And he said, you're going to do so much and you'll get it back. And that same day, I was talking to some Russian Jews who had come from this. They were old enough; they had come from the actual Soviet Union, and they were talking about how once they got out of the Soviet Union, they were able to flourish so much, because when things were really hard, you learned to work harder, to try harder, to do everything 300%, because that's what you need just to get by. And when you do that, the moment that pressure's off, you just skyrocket to success and to fulfillment. And I'd like to think that maybe that's where Israel is right now, that we're kind of suffering, but someday that's building some strength in us. And someday when that pressure gets lifted, that strength is going to allow us to be what we say in Hebrew, Or L'Goyim, a light unto the nations.
Wow, I love that. That's really powerful. And I mean, that is something we'll be hoping and praying for. 100%. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Daniel, thank you so much. Like, genuinely, that was really insightful, and I really think that's going to, especially right now, is going to be so helpful to our listeners.
Thank you. Insightful, sure. Inciting.
No, insightful.
Big difference.
Yes. Thanks so much for having me. It was really wonderful to get to talk to you.
Likewise. You take care, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
My pleasure.